So at the studio with Kitchen Theory, we have Dr. James Kinross, a reader in surgery and consultant surgeon at Imperial College London. Dr. Kinross, thank you so much for joining us.
It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having you. And you must 100% call me James.
Oh,
no one calls me. I feel very honoured to be.
Yeah. Well, start formally. We can work our way.
Yeah.
James, we met several years ago, and I think we were just discussing this a moment ago. We had met through Professor Roger Kneebone, and I believe it was at a Cancer Research UK meeting. If I'm honest with you, I can't even remember exactly what the details were of that, but I just remember feeling at the time very honored to be in that room with all of you discussing this. And I think at the time what we were looking at was really diets for, I believe it was patients who were in remission at that point. And we were looking at how diet could impact, sustain kind of recovery. And you turned to me, I remember at one point during the meeting, we were having a chat and you mentioned the importance of fiber. And it's something that kind of planted a seed that ever since has been growing and growing in terms of my interest. From that point, I started becoming more and more interested in this idea about fiber and its importance and the relation that had to our health and well-being. And then it was probably just before the pandemic that I started really becoming interested in the microbiome.
Yeah.
And then had to do a lot of reading, start figuring out what exactly that was. I'd heard of the brain-gut axis, and I'd been familiar with that in the past, but the microbiome was still something that was completely unknown to me. And then throughout the pandemic, I ended up reading a lot more about this, and then ended up, of course, coming across your book, which, I mean, of all the books that I've read around this topic, you've made this so accessible, and it's coming from someone who's got such a strong kind of clinical background. Your background is in surgery, though. So what I've been fascinated by is why does a surgeon, what takes them into this realm of the microbiome? How did you end up going into that area?
So the answer to that question comes in two parts. The first part is because I'm driven by this idea that the majority of the diseases that I operate on are preventable. They shouldn't have happened. And one of the most important ways to prevent nearly all disease is through nutrition, diet, and sustained behavioral change. And if you want to understand how any of those interventions work, you have to know about bugs, that you just have to know about it. The second answer to that question is, like all things in life, it was a happy accident. So I was bumbling along, must have been like 2005. I wanted to be a surgeon. I was pretty focused on that. And this world was completely alien to me. And I met someone who was very important in my career, and he said, look, come and do some research with me. He said, I want you to go and speak to this scientist because he's got some interesting ideas. And one of those ideas was the microbiome. And at that point, the microbiome was an emerging science. It wasn't really anything that was taken very seriously. It certainly wasn't credible science. And it immediately captured my imagination.
And when was this, out of interest?
That was 2005, yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But that's really early on because, and correct me if I'm wrong, because one of the reasons I'm really excited about having this conversation with you is kind of fact-checking what I know as well. So please do correct me as we go along. But am I right in thinking that it's only really in the last 20 years that we've had the technologies available to better understand the microbiome and to better understand the brain-gut axis?
I think that is true. I think, like all things in science, though, there is a process of rediscovery. We've known since the 70s, in fact, we've known since the 1940s and 1950s that mutualistic microbes, so bugs that live within us that are there for our benefit, have an important role in influencing our health.
Okay.
You know, if you go back to Burkitt's work in the 1970s, we knew that diet and bug interactions were really important in defining lots of aspects of our health. But we just didn't have access to the tools that gave us the detail. Like, there was no way to access the microbiome. And that was for a number of technical reasons. So back in the early 2000s, if you wanted to study bacteria, for example, you had to culture them. You had to go to a lab and sequence them out, and that was the only way to do it. And you could only culture at that point maybe 20 to 30% of what was in the human body. Those microbes had such specific requirements for growth that
Right,
you just couldn't do it in the lab. But also it was very difficult to study communities and how those communities of different types of microorganisms interact. And sequencing, genetic sequencing technologies were in many ways the tools that unlocked that. And with that has come a couple of other parallel technologies. So it's not just sequencing. If you want to understand the language of microbes, you have to understand the science of small molecules. So we look at proteins and smaller molecules like metabolites, and those sorts of technologies came through that allowed us to do that. And of course, computing was the thing that underpinned it all. It was mathematics and computational biology that then allowed scientists to begin to make sense of this massive, overwhelming data set that was just previously inaccessible. So a couple of things happened in parallel, explosion in the science outside of clinical medicine. So a lot of this work actually happened in the soil sciences and environmental sciences, and healthcare actually kind of looked to them and stole those ideas and took them into healthcare.
And to give people, I guess, to take a step back, just so that everyone watching were on the same page, I probably should have started with this. How would you describe in the way that you have, I guess, in your book, in very layman's terms, what the microbiome is?
Sure.
And I guess what its purpose is, and why this has become such an area of interest in the last, let's say 20 or so years.
So a microbiome, by definition, is a collection of all microscopic organisms that exist within a niche and all of the things that those microbes need to sustain themselves. So that's not just bacteria, it's archaea, which are, an ancient but very distinct kingdom of microbes, look a lot like bacteria, but which are not. It's viruses, yeasts, it's parasites, it's all small organisms. But for me, the definition of a microbiome has a couple of other really critical components which are not often discussed. So the first thing to say is that those niches exist at all scales. So within us, we have microbiomes that exist within our gut, on our skin, in our lungs, but they also exist in all life forms, and they exist at planetary scale. You can conceptualize it that way. And the second really key thing to understand about microbiome science is that microbiomes have an evolutionary relationship with the host that they inhabit. The microbes within us, they're not there by accident. They're not there by happenstance. They have evolved with us.
So this is a symbiotic relationship that we have with them.
Exactly right. So these microbes were on the planet before we got here. They'll be here after we've gone, right? And a lot of our cellular processes have a reliance on them for normal function.
So putting this in very kind of down to earth terms, we're essentially like hosts for all these bacteria, viruses, fungus that live on us, and they're serving a purpose for us and we're serving a purpose for them.
I don't think of it as simply kind of a host-passenger relationship. I think it's more nuanced than that, because, and that's why the evolutionary component of the description is important. It's not just a symbiosis in terms of, our day-to-day health. Yeah. It's an evolutionary symbiosis. And we've got a word for that, right? Because, scientists like to really overcomplicate things with words. So that's a philo-evolutionary symbiosis, a phylosymbiosis. And actually there's a word called a holobiont. We're a holobiont. And a holobiont describes an organism that has co-evolved in symbiosis with all of the microbes that make up that organism, right? So I think of us not as a sort of host. I think of us as existing in a kind of phylosymbiotic relationship, which is profoundly connected. They're not passengers. They're there in a much more meaningful way. And the kind of second component to understanding what a microbiome is that's really, really important to understand is the component of time. Because that relationship is not constant. It doesn't exist in a steady state throughout our lives. It hasn't existed in a steady state in an evolutionary construct. But the demands of that relationship vary greatly when you're an infant, when you're growing, and they change as you age. And they will change with the stresses and insults that we have to deal with in our lives. Like, so in my job, you started by noting that I'm a surgeon in my job, right? I spend my day, causing controlled injuries to people, basically. These have dramatic effects on that relationship, and therefore it's really, really important to understand it. So you've got to understand the evolutionary component, and you've got to understand the scale component, and you've got to understand the time component, and then you get a sense of why this is such a tricky thing to study.
And talking about these environments, at one
Yeah.
point you mentioned, I found this really interesting, this idea of kind of an internal climate that we have. And you also mentioned that there's an internal climate crisis.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
So this is increasingly becoming the focus of my work. So I think it's an interesting and important way to help communicate the scale of the challenge that we are facing and the significance of the loss of our internal biodiversity to human health. We all understand what happens if you lose biodiversity in Amazonian rainforests or in barrier reefs or in any kind of, important ecosystem to planetary health. Yet we don't conceptualize the same thing happening within us. If you take the assumption that the microbiome is a complex, massive, hugely diverse ecosystem, which it absolutely is, then it is also vulnerable to the same external forces that are influencing the planetary climate, right? So mass urbanization, globalization of our diet, digitization of our culture, production of excessive pollutants, all of these things influence our internal ecosystems. And what I'm arguing is that in a very, very short period of time, so 70, 80 years, that maps on very closely to the discovery of antibiotics, our internal ecology has, been profoundly changed.
And then is this why, or the increase of a lot of modern day illnesses are being linked to changes in our microbiome? So I found it interesting while reading up about the microbiome. It seems, and I guess this is because it's an area that's quite a hot topic.
Yeah.
A lot of different people from different backgrounds are researching and trying to find interesting links. But it almost feels like you could read about any illness and in some way link it at the moment to your gut health. Is there good reason for that? Is there good research to support that idea? Because I'm talking about everything from type 2 diabetes, autism, irritable bowel syndrome, allergies, mental illness, including Alzheimer's and even depression, and various other things that we've got here that there's research out there suggesting that possibly gut health is linked to the causation of these. And you mentioned at the beginning that I guess your feeling as a surgeon is that a lot of what you're operating on could be treatable through diet. So are we saying that potentially some of these ailments are treatable through diet?
So I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to unpick it a little bit because there's 2 or 3 different themes in there, and I'll try and break it down. So the first thing to say is that what we are collectively suffering from as a global population of humans is a pandemic of diseases of progress. So if you go back 100 years, what killed you was pneumonia. It was tuberculosis, it was cholera, gastrointestinal infections, basically it was pathogens. You died of infection. Of course, not everyone died of infections, and of course some people died of other things, but it was rare to live long enough to get cancer and rare to live long enough to have these, what we call non-communicable diseases that cause a big burden of disease, right? And through the evolution of antibiosis, so antibiotics and antisepsis and all these sorts of theories, slowly that became less and less of a problem. And actually what kills you today is not those things. I'm not saying those things don't kill people or they're not a problem. Yes, multi-drug resistant TB, huge problem. People still die of pneumonia. But statistically, the thing that most likely to kill you today is a cardiovascular disease. It's a heart attack or a stroke. You're going to suffer the consequences of obesity and type 2 diabetes. You're going to have cancer. You're going to have mental health problems. And also young people today are much more likely to be afflicted by conditions that don't kill them. So these are conditions that are caused by a dysfunction in our immunology at some level, right? So whether that might be asthma, allergy, eczema, inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatoid arthritis, all these sorts of problems, right? And the problem is that many clinicians look at all of those problems in silos. They just become an expert on the one disease and they don't look across them. But if you look across the silos, you see an undeniable, massive growth in all of these problems. And the basic hypothesis that I have and others around the world have, it's not just mine, is that the growth in those diseases is of course multifactorial. Lots of it come through industrialization of food manufacturing and all the rest of it and a growing population. But it's certainly been a byproduct of our success at killing microbes. We've been so effective at stopping pathogens that we have inadvertently started to destroy swathes and whole populations, communities of mutualistic microbes that you really, really need to maintain your health, right? So that's the basic hypothesis. We've just become so good at killing microbes that actually we've gone too far the other way, and then we have this kind of burden of diseases of progress. Now, the second thing to say is that, of course, the microbiome is not the only reason for this. But what I am saying is that if you want to understand those reasons, you have got to have a knowledge of the microbiome, because that microbiome's got to fit into that engine of that model that you build, right? If you don't have it, you can't build a complete model. And the way I think about it is instead of gene environment interactions causing diseases, it's actually gene environment microbiome interactions, because the microbiome literally sits between the environment, the things you eat, the things you consume, the pollutants you interact with, cigarettes you smoke, whatever, and the genes that you have, your genetic predisposition for risk, right? So, and everything in your environment has to go through that microbiome. So the microbiome is not a panacea, but it's an absolutely critical piece of the puzzle. And because the microbiome has so many different molecular languages, so many different processes through which it can influence our health, it is linked to all of these diseases. But there is one really important way through which it modifies our health, and that is through its control and regulation of our immune system. It literally is a puppeteer of our immune system. It sets up our immune systems for healthy living, and it constantly chatters to it throughout our existence. And if that relationship breaks down, then yeah, you've got a common mechanism through which all of the diseases that you've described happen. So type 2 diabetes, obesity is not a metabolic disease, and it's an inflammatory disease. Mental health problems are generally, not exclusively, but are commonly a problem of neuroimmunobiology, right? And so is neurodegeneration and degenerative disease of the brain. If you want to look at cancer, it's a problem of inflammation of a dysfunctional immune system. And that's why the microbiome is so important. So yeah, I absolutely believe it to be linked. My final point is that a major criticism of microbiome science is that it has suffered from association science. Because it's so hard to study, there's been like tens of thousands of studies published where we associate a set of microbes with a disease state. Of course, that's not enough. What you have got to do is move beyond that to mechanism. You've got to say, this is how those microbes are causing that disease, or this is where it fits into that process. And that is really hard to do. So in 20 years, we've had a revolution in our understanding of the microbiome, but we've still got so much more to learn, because that mechanistic piece takes time.
So one of the questions that, as you were talking about this, I'm thinking, given that every individual's microbiome is so distinct, how do you start to, once you've even started to understand how the functions of the different actors in your microbiome, how do you then go about providing any form of treatment that you know will affect someone, given that there's not going to be a standard, right? There's not going to be a one-size-fits-all type of diet that you can give people that's just going to turn their microbiome around, right? So how does that work in terms of then people trying to understand this and this actually taking effect in terms of the outcomes? How do people put this to use?
That's a super interesting question, and I'm going to try and answer it succinctly.
Sorry, yeah, it's a very random and broad
No, it's
one.
not random. It's very, very pertinent and really, really important. So diet and improving health. So the gift of the microbiome really is in disease prevention. It's very, very important in therapy, but in my personal opinion, its gift is in prevention. Now, you don't need to know anything about the microbiome to make population level nutritional and dietary changes to improve health. You started this conversation by talking about fiber, right?
Yeah.
Let's just all eat more fiber. We'll all be more healthy, right? It's not rocket science. In this conversation, we don't need to have it. But what you are basically describing is personalized healthcare. How do we take a measure of the nuanced differences in your biology and my biology to give you nutritional therapies or dietary therapies or medical therapies that work very well in you? So that means they don't just sort the problem out you're trying to fix, but they don't cause you side effects or harm, right? And to do that, you've got to know about the microbiome. And the reason you've got to know about it is because the microbiome is the most variable thing in our biology. So your genome and my genome, right, is 99.9999% the same. Yeah. There are a couple of small genes that are important, right? But, basically it's the same. Our microbiome, you and I probably share less than 10% of the same bugs at a species level, right? Don't forget, we're talking about 100 trillion bacteria, the same number of microbes that make up all of the cells in your human body, okay? And you and I probably share less than 10% at a strain or species level. Now, the counter argument to that is that we might share microbes that have the same function. So you and I might have different species of Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, right? But actually they might have the same function. So we might have a catalogue of functions that are common between us that just allow us to be healthy. They allow us to grow. Like we can grow a human being without any microbes if you really want to. You won't be very happy, but you can do it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that to get to that point where you can have a sense of that variation, you've got to be able to measure it. And that's really hard to do because actually as a community of scientists and clinicians, we haven't really decided on a standardized way to do that yet. And you can also conceptualize the microbiome in lots of different ways. You can think about who is there, right? So what type of bugs are within you and what is the ecology of you? We've got a word for that, which is meta-taxonomy, right? Or you can think about what are those microbes doing? Like, what functions do they have? And do they have the right functions in you to maintain health and to give you all of the things that you need, right? Whether it's vitamin absorption or gut-brain development, or whatever it might be. And again, we haven't really decided on the optimum or best way to do that. But also, and here's the really super interesting bit, how do you decide what those functions are at any given moment in your life? Given that I've started this conversation by saying what an infant needs is different to what an adult needs, right? And how do you decide that variance, not just at an individual level, but within different cohorts of genders or sexes, or within different ethnicities or cultures or groups or sizes? So that's a super interesting challenge, which lots of research groups around the world are beginning to solve. But the good news is there are lots of examples where you can really do this, and you can do it and it works really, really effectively. You know, you can really target specific microbes, right? So for example, in my world, chemotherapy, there's a particular chemo drug that people have called irinotecan, and that medicine is really toxic. It causes awful diarrhea. Turns out that diarrhea is caused not by the drug, but by bacteria in the gut activating that drug into something which is toxic. You can target that one enzyme, that one function. You can knock down the bacteria. The chemotherapy stops causing diarrhea. You have more chemo, your cancer outcomes get better, you feel well. Sometimes, though, it's just too hard to do. That biology is too overwhelming. There is too much noise. There's too much complexity. The way that I conceptualize that complexity in my head when I talk about it is through something called orchestral signaling. I think of the microbiome like an orchestra, right? It's a big band. There's lots of different sections in that band, and they're playing a symphony of you, Joseph, for your life. It's just for you. It's your song. And that song will crescendo, and it will get quiet, and it will be loud, and it will boom, and different bits of the band will wake up in different parts of the time. And that symphony is really important for your health. But sometimes if you can't unpick the notes and you don't know what the score is saying, what you got to do is just get a new orchestra, right? So that's why things like fecal transplant work. The orchestra just can't be fixed. The tune is too indecipherable. So we're going to make a wholesale change to that ecosystem. We're going to take a brand new ecosystem from someone that's healthy, and that's through fecal transplant. And we're going to put it into someone that's not very well to try and get that orchestra singing again.
So, but fecal transplants, and I've read a little bit about this because I first came across this in your work, and I mean, it seems like they're the miracle cure for, I mean, you can definitely see the results end up in people having a healthier gut.
Yes, sometimes.
Oh, right.
So it's not, unfortunately, it's not quite as straightforward as we would all like it to believe. So for those of your listeners and viewers that don't know, fecal transplant's been done for thousands of years. It's not a new thing, like all things in science, right? Chinese were doing it several thousands of years ago, famously for traveler's diarrhea. They would call it yellow soup. And, you know, it's been going in the modern era since about the 1950s when Ben Eisman started doing it for a particular infection in the gut called Clostridium difficile. It's like a hospital-acquired infection typically. And this can be very difficult to treat, and antibiotics don't work very well. And FMT, which is fecal microbiota transplantation, just is transformative. It works better. It's more cost-effective than antibiotics. It works more effectively than antibiotics. It works dramatically well. But the thing to say about FMT is that it's been used, again, for a long time as a tool for studying the microbiome. It's an experimental
right,
system in mice or in animals and in humans to try and understand what happens when you change communities. So if I change a community with an X, where I take bugs from Y and I cross them over, like what happens? As a medical therapy, it's become very popular with the growth of microbiome science, because if we take the hypothesis that the microbiome is important in the causation of all of those diseases that we've just talked about, then you might argue, well, okay, what happens if I just change the bugs in someone that's got diabetes or obesity or, anxiety or depression, and see what happens? So today we've got well over 400 trials of fecal transplantation happening in all of these diverse diseases. And it turns out it's much harder than you might think. And there's a couple of reasons why it's really hard. The first is that we're very, very bad at targeting the right donor to the right recipient. So if you had a heart transplant or a kidney transplant or a lung transplant, you would have a detailed bunch of science that would happen to make sure your immune systems could tolerate each other, and then you would transplant the organ. We don't do that in FMT because there's a big mechanistic gap in our understanding. We don't really know what are the good bugs and what are the bad bugs, or what are the good functions, and how you make sure that you replicate that into someone. And not all fecal transplants, the word that we use is engraft, will stick in the recipient and grow there and then have the functions that you really need. And also, just because you've got the bugs there, you still got to feed them. You still got to give them what they need to survive and what they need to live and to be happy and to prosper, right? So fecal transplant as a clinical science, as a clinical therapy, is really in its infancy. But it's totally crazy because it does the most extraordinary things.
And supposedly it also works pretty rapidly as well, right? In terms of, I believe I was listening to a podcast that you were on, and you'd mentioned some research where there'd been an exchange of fecal implants between, was it males in the US and males in Africa?
No, so that was a subtly different piece of work, which I'm sure we'll talk about, looking at dietary exchange.
That was dietary exchange, right.
But FMT is totally bonkers. So if you look at, you can change behavior. Wow. You can change the response of drugs. So another good example would be a trial that was published a few years ago by a group in the US. These were looking at patients who had something called metastatic melanoma. So they had skin cancer, it had spread to their liver, it spread to their brain, it spread throughout their bodies. And these patients were on a very, very expensive and transformative medicine called a checkpoint inhibitor. It's a form of immunotherapy. And in these patients, the immunotherapy had stopped working, which meant these patients were going to die. They were going to die, and that was that. And so they took 16 of these patients and they said, look, let's give them a fecal transplant. Let's just see if we can get the bugs to switch on the immune system again so that they'll respond to the drugs. And in half of the patients that got the FMT, it worked. Their drugs started working, their cancer got smaller. So FMT is this extraordinarily interesting tool for studying the microbiome. It is an extraordinarily powerful therapeutic tool in very specific circumstances, but it's not necessarily the future of microbiome targeted therapy. Right. In the future, maybe what we want is to synthesize these communities down, give it in a really targeted and really...
So rather than wiping the slate clean and reintroducing, as you said, a new orchestra, it's more about understanding how to tweak the orchestra that you've got and how to bring in better support in certain instruments, let's
exactly
say.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly right.
So, okay, fecal transplants are pretty much a blunt tool to do the job. What about just changing one's diet? We were saying there about kind of the diet exchange. So can I just adopt a different type of diet that's in some way going to improve my microbiome?
So yes, all microbiome systems are very heavily influenced by nutrition and by diet. So what I often say to my patients is, if you've got a car that's broken and the engine isn't running very well, you have to think about the fuel you put in the engine if you want to get that engine running properly. And it's the same in us. And again, because you've got those evolutionary relationships where microbes in the gut, they rely on and they're dependent on the nutritional fuel you put into your engine. Of course, that's going to be an important determinant of their health as much as yours. And again, I would answer your question in two ways. The first way is, can you make generalizable recommendations for the average person watching this video who just wants to be a bit healthier, who's basically quite well and just wants to be a bit healthier? Or can you leverage that information in a very, very targeted way where diet becomes therapy in its own right, where it becomes a medical therapy because you're using it in a highly selective way to target a specific set of microbes or their functions or specific, functions of the food product itself to have a very specific benefit.
And is that what you would call precision nutrition?
Correct. That's exactly what I would call it. Like, I think if you're using an app that's based on just an analysis of your genome to guide nutritional therapy, it's a complete waste of your time because it's not determined by your genome.
Sure.
Right.
But, well, yeah, you'd have to be supplying samples of your waste, wouldn't you, on a regular basis to be able to kind of keep up with understanding, because surely your microbiome is changing daily, weekly, monthly, right? So,
well, no, it's not actually. I mean, the microbiome as in adults is really pretty stable. So so you brought up an example of some work that was involved in looking at nutritional interventions in high risk. So I'll just briefly explain that study and then I'll qualify my statement, right? So that study was trying to understand why certain populations are at very, very high risk of colorectal cancer, so bowel cancer, and why others aren't. So the population with the highest risk is African American men. They have a risk of 100 per 100,000 of bowel cancer, and there's lots of reasons why that happens. It's not just biology, it's also access to healthcare and socioeconomics and cultural problems, all the rest of it. But nonetheless, they have the highest risk. The lowest risk are rural South Africans that eat almost no protein, animal fat. They eat it very rarely. They eat very, very high fiber diets, so like 50 grams plus of fiber per day, super lean, super active. So we were like, this is an interesting set of people to study. And we wondered what happened if we crossed over their diets. So we took these two groups of people and we locked them in a house. And we did a colonoscopy before, and then we followed them whilst they were on their normal diet, and then we crossed over their diet. So the African men got to eat an American diet, and the Americans got to eat an African diet, and then we measured what happened to their gut function, and then we did another colonoscopy. We took a bunch more biopsies, right? And we were really surprised by the findings because what we were expecting to see was wholesale changes in the metataxonomy, that word again, like the ecology of the gut, right? And we didn't. Actually, the microbiome, it did change, but it was pretty subtle and it's pretty nuanced and it stayed the same. But the function of the microbiome dramatically changed, like it completely switched over. So think of the microbiome like it's like in the colon at least, it's a giant fermenting engine. That's what it does, it ferments, right? So all of the bugs in the African gut started switching on genes that allowed them to break down proteins. And as a result of those genes being switched on, they started pouring out lots of really toxic, nasty metabolites that caused inflammation in the gut. And we could measure that. And the African American men had exactly the opposite effect. So their bugs started becoming really adept at metabolizing fiber. They started farting like racehorses. They moaned intensely about it. They were very unhappy about the blandness of the diet, but their guts just became really anti-inflammatory, and we could measure that in the biopsies that we took. And so these things were completely reciprocal, and that was just with a 2-week nutritional and dietary intervention. So the microbiome is actually pretty stable, but it doesn't mean you can't change it. Right, and so you can change its functions, and B, if you do want to change it, you've got to think not just about making those simple changes. You might have to make other introductory changes. So, for example, you might want to add in a bit of fermented food. You might have to make other lifestyle changes that you really need to kind of get that microbiome to shift. And some microbiomes are much more resilient to change than others.
So talking about fermented foods, I remember watching a documentary at university, and this is now this is well over 20 years ago, that was talking about prebiotic or probiotic drinks that they sell. I can't remember.
So that's probably worth clarifying for the sake of this conversation. So a probiotic is a living bacteria that has a proven health benefit, and it's typically a foodstuff, right? So it's classified as a foodstuff. A prebiotic is a non-digestible fiber, so you as a human can't digest it, but microbes selectively digest it, and it has a proven health.
And we get these fibers. So the probiotics are in our gut. The prebiotics are the fruit, veg, and stuff like that we consume that then get broken down. They essentially nourish, supplement, fortify the probiotics.
Correct. So prebiotic fibers are often found in things like coloured fruits and vegetables and these sorts of foods. And they come in lots of different forms, and many of your viewers, I'm sure, will be aware of them. So, example might be inulin or fructooligosaccharides or galactooligosaccharides. And you're right, they are selectively metabolized by microbes, usually in the gut. It's usually in the large bowel where they really do their work. And the byproduct of that breakdown is usually molecules that are anti-inflammatory or have some health benefit. So the most famous one, at least, would be something called short-chain fatty acids, and a butyrate would be a really good example of that. So famously known and well studied. And we know that when you have lots more of these fibers, basically that they have an anti-inflammatory effect on the gut. A probiotic, it's an interesting thing that you've just raised, and I think it's worth briefly talking about. Most of the probiotic strains that you would buy as a consumer are basically lactobacilli or bifidobacteria strains.
Yeah.
And sometimes they might be, Saccharomyces boulardii, which is not a bacteria, it's fungi, but basically they're those strains. Increasingly, though, you're seeing new strains coming onto the market which are not those. They have been identified from human studies where we've been able to go into the human microbiome and identify probiotics, so beneficial microbes from within the gut that we can then synthesize and then sell as a product. So the best example of that would be something like Akkermansia muciniphila, which is, a kind of classic human probiotic strain. And you're seeing these now come onto the market.
So when it comes to, let's say, the ingesting and actually absorbing the nutrients from foods, that's a big part of what our microbiome is doing, right?
Yeah.
And when it comes to, I guess, eating highly processed foods, our body finds it, am I right in thinking that, well, number one, I guess the more you process foods, the more you break down that food matrix, right? And the more you kind of disrupt the natural delivery mechanisms that come in the food structure, that your body kind of absorbs it. And then because I guess people are living on I guess one of the big issues that we have around the world is people living on a very highly processed diet. Is that part of what's creating this issue with people's diets and their microbiome essentially not being stimulated in the right way and them not being able to produce their gut is producing these toxins because of the quality of what we're feeding our bodies?
So there's a really important point that I want to talk about. The way I think about it is that microbes influence, I didn't say control, they're not the only lever, but they influence just about every aspect of our approach to foods. They influence the way we think about food, they influence our appetite, they influence our food-seeking behaviors. Now, if you go back to the 1940s, in the United Kingdom, we were coming out of the Second World War. We had, food stamps. We had a starving population. Antibiotics had just been discovered, and as early as the 1940s, scientists realised that antibiotics were super useful in animal husbandry. So you could feed up the chickens and feed a population. And what they noticed very quickly is that if you give antibiotics to a chicken, it gets fatter. It gets fatter, and it gets fatter faster. So they started using antibiotics in all aspects of farming and agriculture because it was a very good way of feeding a starving population. And then actually antibiotics were then systematically missold to the farming community over the next 30, 40 years. So if you go back to the 1940s, what you see is chickens getting fatter quicker because their microbiomes are profoundly damaged. So if you want to understand why that causes obesity, you have to come back again to an earlier point in our discussion, which is the discussion around inflammation. If you kill all the microbes in an animal, they become inflamed because you lose the anti-inflammatory brake that these microbes have in maintaining the health of the gut. It creates other problems, but that's an overwhelmingly big problem. And that's basically the core mechanism that drives obesity and which drives type 2 diabetes. So what I'm saying to you is that you've got a generation of kids and young people who just don't have guts that are set up in the correct way with the right ecology and the right construct to manage a balanced diet. And then on top of that, you're chucking in a westernized diet. So you're taking a gut that's already inflamed, that's not very happy, and you're then getting these big super blooms of the wrong types of bacteria, which are particularly adept at breaking down a McDonald's and that high fat diet, right? And then that's what causes the chaos. And so if you then just change your diet and you say, oh, great, we're going to go back to a high fiber diet, we're going to neglect all of these. We're going to try and reverse our diet as a vehicle for trying to correct those antimicrobial scarring. It doesn't always work. Those microbes are simply going to come back the way that you need to have them for optimal health. It's not quite that straightforward. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't try it. It doesn't mean that nutrition isn't a really important therapy for doing it. It's just nuance. And the science is catching up with the theory. Like there's just quite a big gap there, I think, in our understanding.
So what are your thoughts on supplementation? Because I guess you just mentioned there how important I guess the idea of eating whole foods, you can absorb the right nutrients, minerals, and vitamins from. But because of the way a lot of our food is grown, does it contain all the nutrients, minerals, vitamins that we need? And is supplementation, is that something that works? Because what I have also read about supplements that's made me quite wary of them is the idea of, again, because you're not getting whatever vitamins, minerals, or nutrients that you need, because they're being delivered, let's say in pill form or liquid or whatever it may be, and not in that food matrix, that it may just pass through you.
Yeah.
So how does one manage that then? Because, I mean, the nutrients, minerals, vitamins that we're getting from the kind of fruits and vegetables you get in store, are they really packed with everything that you need?
So it's a really interesting question. So this year I went for the first time to one of Europe's biggest supplement sort of expos, right? And I was invited to give a talk, and I went, and it blew my mind. I just wondered why I'd spent the last 25 years doing any form of science at all, because like there's just none in it. There's none. Like the whole thing is just marketing bollocks. It's extraordinary, and there's just none. And you go and speak to these science, there's no understanding of any science whatsoever. But having said that, I don't want to demonize supplements. Like I use supplements in my patients. In fact, I've done trials of supplements because, for example, we think, well, look, if you can't get the fiber into people because their gut can't cope with it and they can't, make that sustained behavior change, well, let's just give them the end product of fiber metabolism. Let's give them that molecule butyrate, right?
But that's where there's like a major deficiency.
Correct, right? So we in fact, we've got that trial ongoing at the moment in northern Alaska, right? Can you just give butyrate supplements and bypass the problem, right? Can you engineer and solve the problem? And actually, that's a reasonable strategy. I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with supplements per se. I think the problem comes when the cart goes before the horse and you've got supplement companies creating fear, anxiety, making promises they just cannot keep. And you've got young people thinking that actually they can just supplement their way out of a problem. And you can't. Like, it's not a shortcut. You need to have a diverse, balanced diet, which you prepare and cook yourself. You've got to have ownership of the ingredients you put into your food, and you've got to think and take responsibility for the impact that is having on your health. You can't abdicate that. And actually trying to empower people to give them that control is what I'm interested in. It's really super hard to do it. Like my bigger bugbear than supplements is actually food delivery apps. I think they are more dangerous, more toxic.
Well, now people are ordering breakfast, lunch, and dinner on apps, right?
I just think they are really, really evil.
Yeah.
And they should be deleted or regulated in a way that they're currently not. And it's like, if you ever got time to kill, go onto a Reddit supplement forum. It's amazing. Like it's like people are just extraordinary. They micromanage every aspect of their diet based on a supplement regime. You don't have to do that. Your microbes will do that for you. So think less as someone that is trying to hack the system and bypass it all into supplements. So think more like a conservationist. Think more like a dietary microbial conservationist. What you want is a rich, diverse, healthy, growing ecosystem. And to do that, you need to have a diverse, rich, healthy diet. You need to exercise. You need to stop smoking. Do all of those things that you already know you need to do. It's just that the microbiome explains why many of those things work.
I want, just because you've touched on this, but I do want to ask you about this. Puppets in microbial strings was the term that really caught my attention. And I mean, I'd read about this before, this notion that, how in control are we over maybe our desires, our appetite for certain foods. And again, this is me kind of asking this in terms of just trying to reaffirm if I've got this right. Is there a possibility that the bugs in our gut are driving what it is that we desire to eat?
So, yes, I think it's true. But I think it varies depending on what sort of state you're in and who you are and when that happens, right? So we've got some really, really good examples of, definitely when that happens, like food poisoning and salmonella, for example.
Right.
Salmonella directly suppresses your appetite and your wish to eat. And we know how that happens. We know that gut hormones that drive appetite are directly influenced and regulated by specific microbes. And we know how that happens. What I'm interested in is pregnant women suddenly getting weird food, desires. Like my hunch is, I don't have this science to support this, but my hunch is, my theory is, my hypothesis is that microbes are playing a super important part in that process. Like,
Right.
and I think it does. What microbes definitely do.
In naturally guiding the pregnant woman into what it is that she needs, because you'd also mentioned here about the kind of physical changes that take place in a woman's womb during pregnancy in preparation for that. So it kind of makes sense as well that it would be preparing her in terms
To me, it's totally logical. I mean, I do, but I mean, listen, I'm a hardliner on this, and I've said this on just about every podcast I've ever been on. But I mean, I believe that the maternal microbiome should be a basic human right. It's so important, not just for maternal health, it's so important for the future health of that gestating infant, because the maternal microbiome constantly signals to the gestating infant through that orchestral signaling pathway that I was telling you about. We know very specifically, we've got very good mechanistic examples where if the microbiome's not happy, the infant doesn't develop. If the maternal microbiome isn't happy, the placenta doesn't develop. You know, we know these things. We just don't measure them in our clinical practice. We don't apply them. And my theory is that children born to mothers who are not, who don't have optimal gut microbial function are then disadvantaged potentially, for the rest of their adult life. And these children, we know who they are. They are socio-economically deprived. They're people from communities that don't have the right educational access, whose mothers don't have the right educational access, who don't have the right health access, that suffer from inequality. And that inequality is, has always been there. And the microbiome is useful because it gives you another way to reframe that inequality. But it's also something that you can target, you can do something about, right? And that's why this conversation, I hope, is helpful, because nutrition and diet is a very, very important way of doing it. And that might be an example where you need personalized nutrition. You say, okay, mum, you've got twins, you've got triplets, you need something a bit different. Or, maybe you're dealing with these particular healthcare problems like, gestational diabetes. We need to give you something much more specific.
I probably haven't covered even half of the notes that I put down for this conversation, but I have one final question. And to end us on a kind of high note, looking at the future of, especially when taking into consideration the kind of advances that we've seen in accessible artificial intelligence, that it's kind of permeating every industry in every way. How is this going to help when dealing with these quite complex problems that are dealing with, big amounts of data? Do you foresee that that's going to have an impact on your, because you mentioned computational science having an impact already on your field of research, but do we think that this kind of rapid interest in AI, and I don't even mean that from a technological point of view, but maybe it's just because there are more people now using AI and looking to find use cases for this in science and research. Do you think that this is going to impact the research in this area over the next decade or so?
Oh, it's going to transform it completely. And it already is. And it's been doing it for some time. Like if microbiome science was enabled by machine learning, right? So my PhD was all on machine learning of these kind of,
Wow, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's again, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding what AI truly is and how you really apply it. But microbiome sciences lend itself extremely well to deep learning because you've got systems complexity where what you're trying to do is not measure every single or interpret every single last nuanced signal in that data set. What you're trying to do is to look for patterns across data sets and to link data sets together. So for example, in the microbiome science, what you really want to know is what the microbiome means in terms of epigenetic modification of the human genome. So the expression of those genes within a person and therefore what its influences on a health outcome. AI is an amazingly good way of linking those those things together. And what you need though to be able to do that is very, very high quality data sets, which have clearly got a set of data standards applied to them. So I want a data set that is massive, like absolutely massive, which is not just, a UK based data set. I want, I want an African and an Indian and a Chinese and a US based data set. And I need to know that those data sets can communicate and to do the same thing. I need a computational language that we can all agree is the right way to do it. And I want, probably the most important thing is I want a set of ethical and governance standards to underpin it, because what I want is equality in those data sets and I want access for everyone to those data sets. What I do not want is Silicon Valley kind of coming in and creating an oligopoly on those data sets that disadvantages us all. A microbiome, its biggest gift is in disease prevention. Therefore, it has to be a data set which is open and accessible by all. And populations where we know there is extreme value in their microbiome for understanding human health, like sub-Saharan African populations, have to have control of their own data sets, and they have to be enabled to mine their own data sets to glean their own value out of it. And so I think we're dealing with these big issues in lots of different aspects of AI science and computational science, and the microbiome is no different. But there is unequivocally a gold rush happening as big companies and startup companies move in to try and, dominate this space by having complete ownership of foundational data sets for AI. But I
want to end on a positive note. I don't know, James, if that's a positive note, but that's quite a concerning note. No, but I get what, yeah.
But I think you can end on a positive note. And I think actually it's really, really important to you because like we've mentioned in this talk, we've made an analogy, about an internal climate crisis, which I do believe in, which is there. But the value of the microbiome is that if you understand it, you can reverse it. The gift of the microbiome is that we can now find solutions to chronic healthcare problems that seriously adversely affect the quality of our very young and our very old and everyone in between that currently have no solutions. Alzheimer's, depression, anxiety, obesity, these sorts of things. The solutions are there. I know that there needs to be policy and economics and right? But within the biological solutions are now really tangible for the first time. So I think you should be optimistic and you should be excited about it. And I also think that diet and nutrition is only going to become more important. What you do is only going to become more important. It's only going to become more targeted. It's only become, more seriously understood by my colleagues in oncology and in surgery and in science as being a therapy in its own right. So I think there is definitely cause to be optimistic.
Awesome. Now, for everyone who comes on the show, I'm fascinated by generative AI and creating kind of conceptual ideas. And what I like to do is take the guests that we have and think about how I would interpret their work into addition some way.
Okay.
So,
oh my gosh.
For you, James, this is...
Are you serious?
The dish that I have created. So I think just by looking at it, it's quite a visual one, this one, in the sense of sort of the work that you do in labs, the research.
Oh, that's
and I
good.
thought about how we could flesh this out in some way and create what looks like this living petri dish of life and edible yummings.
Man, I love it. I love it. You're a genius. That's so cool.
Well, I'm glad you enjoy it.
Are we really going to make this? Can we eat this? I would totally.
We should. Yeah, I always like the challenge. Do you know what I love the challenge of with using generative AI? Is you sit there and you create these things, and a lot of the time it kind of spits things out that you're a bit like, well, that doesn't look like anything. But then you think, well, what could it be though?
Yeah.
And it does get the creative juices kind of
I eat it the whole time
going.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd encourage everyone else to.
I'd even from my side, love the challenge of figuring out how we actually bring this
challenge
to
accepted,
reality.
Challenge accepted. That's wonderful. Thank you.
You're most welcome. So just very quickly though, what I want to end on is how can people find out more about your work? Obviously there is your book, Dark Matter.
Yes.
The New Science of the Microbiome.
Yeah.
Where else can they look you up?
They can find me on dark-matter.org.uk. We're going to create a mailing list and start putting out some updates on there. Yeah, Google me. You'll find me.
There you go. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Awesome.
Thanks.